nature's unspoken rule and the period that broke it. There appears to be an unwritten law woven into the fabric of nature itself. Creatures dwelling in oceans and seas have always been far more terrifying than anything you'd encounter on dry land. We can observe this pattern not only in modern times, but throughout the entire sweep of history, including during the age of dinosaurs, when the aquatic monsters lurking beneath the waves would have filled you with far more dread and terror than even a T-Rex or any dromaeosaur ever could. The truth is, if you search through Earth's vast timeline, you'll struggle to pinpoint even a single moment when the water offered you better odds of survival than staying on land. Yet there existed a brief window in time, an exceptionally long time ago, well before dinosaurs ever walked the Earth, when your chances of staying alive were genuinely higher if you stuck to the oceans and seas, mainly because nearly everything above the waterline, including Mother Nature herself, appeared specifically engineered for maximum nastiness. This unusual era was known as the Lopingian. The Lopingian, geography and oceanography. The name itself probably means absolutely nothing to you, but it actually represents the final epoch of the Permian period, spanning the years between 259 and 252 million years ago. This particular stretch of history left Earth virtually unrecognizable in almost every conceivable way, including something as fundamental as time itself, since back in those days the Moon maintained a much closer orbit around Earth, which resulted in shorter days of roughly 22 hours instead of our current 24. To pile on even more confusion, the geography bore no resemblance whatsoever to what we see today, considering that most of Earth's landmass was consolidated into the supercontinent Pangaea, which meant Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and portions of Europe were all physically connected to one another. Only when you looked eastward could you discover decently sized land masses that had escaped Pangaea's clutches, with the largest of these so-called islands consisting of what we now know as Siberia, Kazakhstan, and North China. Further south, you would have encountered another substantial island composed of South China and various regions of Southeast Asia. On top of that, Turkey, Iran, and Tibet were also separate islands at this point in time, surrounded on one side by the Tethys Ocean and on the other by the Paleotethys. When combined, these two bodies of water were undeniably vast, but they still paled in comparison to the super-ocean that stretched out just west of Pangaea, Panthalassa. This prehistoric ocean was completely unlike anything that came before it or would come after it, occupying well over 60% of the entire Earth's surface and dwarfing even our current Pacific Ocean by a factor of 2. Just what lived in the oceans and seas. Trying to imagine an ocean that's literally double the size of the Pacific is genuinely nerve-wracking and probably should have convinced you to avoid it like the plague. But despite its absolutely enormous size, Panthalassa and the other oceans were actually remarkably tame when it came to the creatures inhabiting them. Sharks were certainly present, having evolved some 200 million years earlier. And if you happen to be something of a Permian enthusiast, you might be picturing the helicoprion, an 8-meter or 26-foot-long shark that's become somewhat of a poster child for Permian marine megafauna and possessed one of the strangest and most unsettling mouths ever seen, consisting of a cluster of large teeth on its bottom jaw arranged into distinctive whorls. However, while this giant shark did indeed exist during the Permian, it had already gone extinct by the Lopingian, which left the oceans relatively empty of giant life forms. That said, relatives of this shark were still swimming around, though none reached anywhere near that impressive size. The biggest Helicidus, for instance, measured only 2 meters or 6.5 feet long, roughly equivalent to the length of a leopard shark, so it definitely wasn't an immense threat, especially since its teeth were specifically designed for soft-bodied animals like squids rather than bony prey. Meanwhile, other sharks like the tenacanthids and hybodonts, while quite diverse, were even smaller, typically growing no more than 1 meter or 3.3 feet in length. The eurypterids, or sea scorpions, that group of now extinct arthropods, were also present but weren't doing particularly well, because while they used to be highly diverse and gigantic during the Devonian period, they were now teetering on the brink of extinction, having never fully bounced back from the Devonian extinction event. With only 2 genera known from this period, and neither were especially large nor apex predators. What caused life in the water to be so unscary? For the most part, pretty much every marine group was struggling, partly due to the Capitanian mass extinction event that had occurred 2 million years prior. It's a relatively obscure event in Earth's history, but it was actually deadlier than both the KT extinction and the Triassic-Jurassic extinction combined. Its effects had been devastating everywhere, yet marine life bore the absolute brunt of it. And thus during the Lopingian you could spot some trilobites, ammonoids, and cephalopods lurking about, but never in any great numbers or impressive sizes. Things would only deteriorate further for marine life, but we'll circle back to that later. At this particular moment, the waters of the late Permian should sound rather boring, but this is actually a key fact to take solace in, because on land you would have gotten absolutely no breaks like you did in the water. The opposite story on land and Earth's old rulers. The Capitanian extinction had brought utter devastation to terrestrial life as well. However, life on land recovered much more swiftly and arguably became even more dangerous than before, since the extinction wiped out the old rulers of Earth, the Dinocephalians, thereby leaving the door wide open for new rulers to emerge and take their place. The Dinocephalians were a group that consisted of large-bodied therapsids who had been extremely diverse and plentiful throughout most of the early and middle Permian. Yet despite all their success, they failed to make it into the late Permian. This conspicuous absence allowed multiple groups to surge ahead, but there was one group in particular that benefited the most, unfortunately for everyone else, and that was the Gorgonopsids, Earth's original saber-tooths. These prehistoric animals were first discovered by paleontologists all the way back in 1876, and their remains were so absolutely horrifying that the researchers decided the Gorgons from Greek mythology were the perfect monsters to name them after. While diverse in their own right, Gorgonopsids still generally shared the same core characteristics, which included deeply set teeth, parasagittal gaits, long narrow skulls, and razor-sharp elongated incisors and canines, making them among the very first saber-toothed predators to evolve on Earth. This presence of saber teeth made them look somewhat like saber-toothed cats, such as the Smilodon, and their bodies were superficially similar as well. But these killers were neither cats nor felines of any kind. They weren't even mammals, as a matter of fact. Instead, they appear to have been therapsids, much like the Dinocephalians before them, who are more closely related to mammals than to reptiles, but still weren't actually mammals. And like the Dinocephalians, Gorgonopsids had been around during a substantial chunk of the Permian, first appearing 265 million years ago during the Middle Stage. In those early times, these saber-toothed predators were incredibly small, being no larger than a person's foot, which made them one of the smaller creatures of that era and forced them to hunt tiny therapsids and reptiles. The largest predator. However, as time marched on and each new genus evolved, they gradually got bigger and bigger, a trend that absolutely exploded during the late Permian after the eradication of the Dinocephalians, which ultimately led to the emergence of the largest Gorgonopsid of all time, Inostrancevia. This predator wasn't just the biggest of its kind, but also claimed the title of largest terrestrial predator from the late Permian, with exceptional fossil remains suggesting that adults could have measured over 11 feet or 3.5 meters long, while weighing upwards of 1,000 pounds or 453 kilograms, equivalent to the size of a large bear, though on average most individuals were more comparable to tigers in dimensions. In addition to being substantially larger than most Gorgonopsids, Inostrancevia was also built differently, as it possessed extremely sturdy, long limbs which made it both durable and surprisingly fast, allowing it to outpace a multitude of medium to large-bodied herbivores. Once caught, these unfortunate prey animals were in for an absolutely terrible time, as Inostrancevia possessed elongated post-canines and supersized upper canines that measured 15 centimeters or 6 inches long, making them among the largest teeth ever seen in non-mammalian therapsids. In addition to being exceptionally lengthy, these weapons were curved and finely serrated, allowing them to slice through flesh with ease, incurring massive blood loss and causing catastrophic damage to vital organs. But despite being clearly lethal, scientists aren't 100% certain how Inostrancevia actually hunted, with two schools of thought existing. Either it used tactics similar to what we see in Smilodons, that is, targeting and taking out the neck, or it would employ something more akin to a bite-and-run strategy, letting accumulated blood loss and shock take their toll over time. Regardless of which method it used, neither sounds like a fun way to go, so you definitely wouldn't want to run into this apex predator. That was also a seriously difficult challenge for animals back then, as Inostrancevia achieved a remarkably widespread range that included what are now parts of Africa, Asia, and European Russia. This saber-tooth also appears to have been highly adaptive, as it routinely showed up in a multitude of vastly different biomes, such as warm floodplains in South Africa or cold, arid deserts in Russia, where relief could only be found near the occasional shallow lake and within thin forests composed of peltosperms, the dominant flora of the late Permian. It's precisely because it lived in these cold, desert environments that some paleontologists theorize it may have even had fur, though this idea remains unconfirmed to this day. Permian Russia was a problem. Now, having one giant Gorgonopsid prowling both hemispheres of Earth would have been bad enough on its own. But the late Permian was actually home to many more species than just Inostrancevia, with dozens of other Gorgonopsid species being known, many of which also lived in the European part of Russia, including the smaller Persalicosaurus and the medium-sized Suchogorgon. This resulted in Gorgonopsids having complete and utter dominance over many ecosystems, where herbivores, regardless of their size, had a Gorgonopsid as their main predator. It also made Permian Russia one of the absolute last places you'd ever want to visit. Although truthfully, it was actually much worse down in South Africa. The giant Gorgonopsids that ruled Africa. South Africa was home to an entire subfamily of giant Gorgonopsids that had independently evolved right alongside Inostrancevia, and they were known as the Rubigini. While Inostrancevia held the title of largest single Gorgonopsid species of all time, the Rubigini were, on average, the largest family overall. They were distinguished by robust skulls, the absence of a parasphenoid bone, frequent tooth replacement cycles, and the possession of deeply serrated teeth that were likely even more effective for cutting than those of Inostrancevia. They were fairly stocky creatures too, with some species coming very close in size to Inostrancevia, as demonstrated by Rubigia atrox, a species of Gorgonopsid that resided within what is today South Africa and Tanzania, where it sometimes grew to be 10 feet or 3 meters long. This body size alone was enough to make it an apex predator, but what was truly impressive and menacing was its skull, as it took up over 15% of an individual's total body length. Not to mention that recovered skulls were also extremely thick and showed clear signs of skull bossing. Those bony protuberances that indicate this predator was specifically built to bite and grapple with powerful, large prey. Yet coincidentally, much like the Smilodon 250 million years after it, Rubigia didn't actually have a particularly strong bite, with reconstructions indicating a bite force of only around 715 newtons, just 20% more powerful than the bite of a wolf. This really just demonstrates how exceptionally well-designed its teeth were for piercing effortlessly through flesh and tough hide. Like Inostrancevia, Rubigia would have been capable of altering entire ecosystems all by its lonesome. Yet sadly for everything else, it was almost never alone, as indirect evidence strongly suggests it routinely coexisted with other members of its subfamily. The subfamily consisted of 9 genera, all ranging in size from medium to large. If this wasn't terrifying enough, it's now believed that it coexisted with Inostrancevia as well, since both had a documented presence in late Permian South Africa. Given their similar sizes and fairly comparable builds, the two most likely shared the same predatorial niche, which almost certainly led to frequent and violent conflict. All of this goes to show that this truly was the planet of the Gorgonopsids, and their dominating presence on land made the water a definitively safer choice. But just to really hammer the point home, I should also mention that the late Permian was home to many other predators too, ones that were nightmarish in their own unique right. The arch-nemesis, Therocephalians. The most notable examples were the Therocephalians. In an emerging trend, this clade consisted once again of therapsids and originated during the Middle Permian. Although unlike the Gorgonopsids, they hadn't achieved such enormous sizes during this time. However, they were equally widespread and actually more diverse, with species being found across Russia, Antarctica, Africa, and China. A small handful were even herbivores. but the vast majority were predators who could have easily been confused for Gorgonopsids by the untrained eye, as they too had relatively large skulls and similar body plans. But there were key differences, with therocephalians tending to have broader, deeper skulls, smaller straight teeth, shorter bodies, and more compact builds. First animals to evolve venom. And as previously mentioned, they were significantly more diverse, resulting in many developing hunting techniques not observed in Gorgonopsids. There was even a chance that a couple species, namely the dog-sized Ichthyobangops and Euchambergia, were venomous, which, if accurate, would make them the very first tetrapods to have evolved venom. You also had species that are often interpreted as being semi-aquatic creatures, like the Inostrancevia, while others were fully terrestrial, hunting large animals using unusual saber teeth, as showcased by the appropriately named Silacosaurus, jaguar-sized predator with a lion-sized head. But of all the therocephalians, the one that stood out the most was Mascarinus, a jaguar-sized predator sporting a lion-sized head that was equipped with numerous, very sharp conical teeth. Its disproportionately large head suggested a fairly powerful bite, and paleontologists believe it hunted prey by pinning them down with its powerful forelimbs before dealing out devastating damage with its razor-sharp teeth and powerful jaws. To further cement its legacy, fossil records reveal that Mascarinus was among the most abundant therocephalians during the late Permian and one of the only non-Gorgonopsids to have achieved apex predator status, perhaps even replacing Gorgonopsids in certain specific environments. But interestingly enough, while not as successful as Mascarinus, there were actually bigger therocephalians, including Megawaitsia, a 3-meter or 9-foot-long distant relative of Mascarinus that prowled European Russia during the first half of the Lopingian. To date, it remains the largest known therocephalian, and based on coprolites, that is, fossilized feces, we know it likely fed upon large dicynodonts, which it might have killed by using venom. Specifically, some studies on its skull seem to suggest that in life it possessed a venom gland and possibly multiple venom ducts that would have delivered fatal amounts of toxin into prey while biting them. However, because remains from its prey tend to be in poor condition, this claim hasn't been fully accepted by the broader paleontology community. By this point, the late Permian should come across as an absolutely hectic place, with therocephalians and Gorgonopsids running rampant everywhere. But even they weren't the entire iceberg, since there were still a whole bunch of other carnivores, all very distinct and unusual in appearance. Other late Permian carnivores. For starters, you had the superficially crocodile-like Proterosuchosids, who were slender but could still reach rather impressive sizes and were equipped with giant needle-like teeth. Unlike the previously mentioned carnivores, this group were actually reptiles and functioned as either terrestrial or semi-aquatic hunters who could be found on every continent except Antarctica and North America. Then there were the Gorgonopsids, who were once again superficially crocodile-like, but possessed extensive armor plating along their backs, perhaps to help protect against attacks from large therapsids. Members of this group could be quite different from one another and were sometimes fully terrestrial, while at other times semi-aquatic. And while they were usually no larger than a monitor lizard, some genera like Eurolurpiton could get quite sizable, specifically in European Russia, where specimens grew to be roughly the same size as female American alligators. Temnospondyls, or rather, primitive amphibians, were also present and thriving on Pangaea, and they were honestly the biggest reason why any animal should have been wary around freshwater. Many had evolved to become specialized ambush hunters that opportunistically fed on anything they could catch in the water or anything foolish enough to venture too close to the water's edge. Of the numerous families that existed, arguably the most lethal to human-sized prey were the Rhinicichids, a family of tetrapods from which living amphibians likely descended. Each species had 4 limbs, a fairly long tail, and body shapes reminiscent of giant salamanders or crocodilians. The largest member you could encounter in a body of freshwater was Inostrancevia, a 13-foot or 4-meter behemoth that resided in South Africa alongside our friends the Gorgonopsids and therocephalians. Talk about an absolutely terrible place to live. And then in European Russia, which also had its fair share of terrestrial hunters, there were the Gorgonopsids to make up for the missing Inostrancevia. Wait, I already mentioned Gorgonopsids. I believe the document meant Areopids here. The Areopids were yet another tetrapod family, but they were more slender and narrow than the Rhinicids, though they could still get pretty big, with certain genera like Clamorosaurus reaching 10 feet or 3 meters from head to tail. Herbivores and the largest animal on Earth. With so much dangerous activity going on, it's genuinely hard to believe that herbivores even managed to survive at all. But they certainly did, and across large swaths of Pangaea, you would have stumbled upon an array of dicynodonts, captorinids, and pariasaurs. Compared to the carnivores, herbivores were actually more diverse and had developed many ingenious tools to survive. One of the more famous herbivores was Lystrosaurus, a badger-to-pig-sized dicynodont that was one of the most abundant animals of that entire era. It had a rather odd build, but it was not to be underestimated, as it sported powerful forelimbs and tusks that it may have used to dig deep burrows that granted much-needed protection from predators. Interestingly enough, the art of digging seems to have been relatively common, as totally separate groups like the cysticephalids also learned to burrow, using their broad skulls to displace large amounts of dirt. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you had the pariasaurs, which took a completely different route and became armored tanks, kind of similar to Ankylosaurus minus the club tail. Specifically, species in this clade often had large bony scuds that were embedded into their skin and possessed highly ossified, dense, heavy bones that provided additional layers of protection. They were also among the largest, if not the largest, late Permian animals to have ever lived, with the most famous member, Scutosaurus, having weighed over 1.2 tons and being similar in length to large Gorgonopsids. At this weight, and given its overall frame, Scutosaurus was a slow-moving animal that relied entirely on its armor to survive. In its case, its defensive capabilities were further boosted by spikes that adorned its skull and muscles that were so incredibly dense they were basically impenetrable. This specific genus was only found within European Russia, but as a family, the pariasaurs had a truly global distribution. Additional herbivorous groups worth mentioning include the edaphosaurids, bolosaurids, and diadectids. Prehistoric skies. As wild and chaotic as the late Permian was, it did have one genuine silver lining, which was that you didn't really have to worry about looking up. Unlike the Mesozoic, which was home to giant pterosaurs capable of eating literal dinosaurs, the Permian didn't really have any dangerous giants patrolling the skies. There were the griffin flies and paleodictyopterans, which could have given you quite the scare, but they were completely harmless to large animals and weren't particularly abundant or diverse thanks to the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Of all the things flying around, the largest animals were probably the Weigeltosaurids, a family of gliding reptiles that grew no larger than a big bat. And while having one tangled in your hair would definitely suck, these guys were only dangerous to insects and spent most of their days on solid ground, or rather in the trees, as their morphology was highly developed for arboreal movement. Mother Nature wanted to kill you too, the great dying. To make up, though, for the lackluster skies, the late Permian had one more devastating trick up its sleeve, so to speak, and that was Mother Nature itself. If you've been following along carefully, you may have noticed that life seemed to be mostly concentrated in just a handful of places, mainly European Russia and Africa. This was because enormous chunks of land were borderline uninhabitable, with estimates suggesting an average temperature of 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, making it twice as hot as the present day. This oppressive heat contributed to severe aridity that plagued the supercontinent and resulted in absolutely massive deserts near the equator, where life was fairly devoid. To make matters even worse, to the north you had the central Pangaean Mountains, an extensive mountain range that spanned across the entire horizontal length of the continent, creating areas that were prone to severe and persistent droughts. To put this into proper perspective, if such extreme conditions suddenly popped up in the present day, life would take a very serious downturn. And the truly crazy part is that this nightmarish climate was actually rather tame for the late Permian. Because if you stuck around long enough until approximately 252 million years ago, you would have witnessed the Earth transform into an apocalyptic wasteland thanks to the late Permian extinction, otherwise known as the Great Dying. That's a fitting name, considering it was Earth's absolute worst extinction event of all time. It is commonly believed that this doomsday event started from the eruption of the Siberian Traps, or rather, was caused by the eruptions that created the Siberian Traps, a massive region of volcanic rock in Siberia that's roughly the same size as Western Europe. These eruptions were unlike anything ever witnessed by humanity and absolutely decimated the entire planet, causing lava flows a full kilometer or 0.6 miles thick and spewing out enough carbon dioxide and sulfur to heat up the surface even more dramatically. In some places, it's thought that the average temperature year-round would have risen to match the average temperature of Death Valley during its hottest month. And if you somehow possessed supernatural heat resistance, you'd still likely die from choking on the constant discharge of different gases that led to a drastic drop in oxygen levels, leading to numerous hypoxia events across the globe. And just in case you needed any more evidence that this time period was seriously messed up, then also know that some studies report these volcanic eruptions caused significant damage to the ozone layer, which may have increased ultraviolet radiation by over 5,000% in some parts of the world. Debates continue to linger on exactly how long these catastrophic effects lasted, but we do know that by the end of them, the Earth was a profoundly different place, with 57% of all biological families and 83% of genera having gone completely extinct. For comparison, while more abrupt, the KT extinction, which famously killed the dinosaurs, only eliminated about 17% of biological families. And despite how devastatingly bad things got on land, life in the water actually suffered even more due to increased water temperatures and ocean acidification. But if you took a dip during this event, you wouldn't have instantly burned to a crisp, and you may have actually enjoyed it initially, considering the sea temperatures during this catastrophic event were likely similar to that of a jacuzzi, giving you just one more reason why you'd rather be in the water during this nightmarish time than struggling to survive on land. Thanks for watching, and until next time at Primeval Planet.